Soundtrack Secrets.
In the damp, industrial city of Liverpool, early 1960s Britain was still recovering from the shadow of war. Streets were grey, rationing had just ended, and a new generation was hungry for something different, something that felt alive. Amidst the smoke and factory noise, four young men began to chase a dream that seemed too far for their working-class roots. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and later, Ringo Starr, names that would soon echo across the globe, were still just boys trying to make music in a place that rarely noticed them. They started in small clubs, playing American rock and roll covers for sailors and locals. The Cavern Club became their crucible, a dark, sweaty basement filled with echoes, cigarette smoke, and raw energy. What made them different wasn't just the music, it was the chemistry. Lennon's wit, McCartney's charm, Harrison's quiet precision, and Ringo's steady rhythm created something magnetic, something no one could quite explain. At a time when Britain was desperate for identity, the Beatles offered not only sound but style, a new language of rebellion wrapped in melody. In 1962, manager Brian Epstein walked down into the Cavern Club for the first time. He saw not just a band, but a revolution waiting to happen. With polished suits, strategic press, and relentless touring, Epstein transformed them from local heroes into a national sensation. The release of Love Me Do that same year was modest, but it cracked open the door. Soon after, Please Please Me burst through it. Fast, infectious, impossible to ignore. By 1963, the Beatles were everywhere. Radio stations couldn't stop spinning their songs, magazines couldn't print their names fast enough, and teenage girls couldn't hold back their screams. Britain had never seen anything like it. Every performance turned into chaos, fans fainting, crying, chasing cars, and waiting outside hotels for days just to catch a glimpse of them. Newspapers coined a new term for the madness, Beatlemania. What started as admiration quickly became obsession. In every city they visited, hysteria followed. Airports turned into fortresses, and police lines were crushed under the weight of human emotion. Their sound wasn't just rock and roll, it was optimism. It was the soundtrack of youth, freedom, and a changing world that suddenly seemed full of possibility. The post-war generation finally had its voice, and it came from four lads who sang about love, dreams, and everything that made life feel worth living. The Beatles weren't just musicians, they were mirrors reflecting a cultural shift. Hair grew longer, clothes got brighter, and the world began to move in rhythm with their songs. In television appearances like The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, the explosion became global. 73 million Americans tuned in, and the next morning, nothing in pop culture was the same again. Record stores sold out within hours. Guitar sales skyrocketed. Thousands of kids decided that day they wanted to be in a band. But behind the cameras and headlines, the Beatles were still young men adjusting to the storm they had created. Fame was intoxicating, but it came with a price they didn't yet understand. The chaos was both beautiful and terrifying. Screams grew louder, shows became unmanageable, and every city felt like a battlefield of emotion. Yet in the middle of it all, they smiled, laughed, and played, because deep down, they still believed in the music. The Beatlemania era had begun, not just a chapter in music history, but a cultural awakening that would ripple through generations. The world would never be the same again. By 1964, the Beatles had conquered Britain, and now they were coming for the world. When their plane touched down in New York, thousands of screaming fans were already waiting, breaking through police barricades just to see them wave. The sound of that hysteria was unlike anything ever recorded before. The moment they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, the world shifted. 73 million viewers tuned in, and for those few minutes, America stopped. Every home, every living room, every heart pulsed with the same rhythm. The British invasion had begun. The Beatles were no longer just a band, they were a global event. Each airport became a sea of tears and posters. Police struggled to control the crowds, while newspapers tried and failed to find words for what was happening. Beatlemania, once a local buzzword, had evolved into a worldwide fever. Fans fainted at concerts, chased cars through city streets, and sobbed uncontrollably at the mere mention of their names. It wasn't just music, it was emotion unleashed. The Beatles themselves were caught in the eye of the storm. They laughed at the chaos, waving from hotel balconies as if trying to make sense of it. But behind closed doors, exhaustion crept in. Every city meant another mob, another sleepless night, another stage drowned out by screams. No one could hear the music anymore, not even the Beatles. The roar of the audience was so overwhelming that they began to lose connection with their own performances. They couldn't hear their instruments, their voices, or even each other. And yet they kept going. Night after night, flight after flight, America, Australia, Japan, the Philippines, everywhere they went, the madness followed. Every show was a war between sound and silence. Brian Epstein tried to hold everything together, press conferences, schedules, interviews, but even he knew this pace couldn't last. The band was burning brighter than ever, and just as quickly, burning out. Still, their creativity didn't fade. In the midst of chaos, they released A Hard Day's Night, capturing the mania on film with humor and honesty. It was both a celebration and a cry for help, a reflection of what fame had become. Fans adored them more than ever, but the four Beatles began to feel trapped by the very image that made them famous. The matching suits, the synchronized bows, the endless smiles, it all started to feel like a costume. Lennon once described it as being inside a bowl of noise. They were surrounded by love, yet isolated by it. Millions screamed their names, but no one really knew who they were anymore. In hotel rooms, they began to seek silence, writing songs, reading books, and exploring new ideas. The innocence of She Loves You was giving way to something deeper, something restless. But the world wasn't ready to slow down. Every city demanded more. Every country wanted a piece of the Beatles. The hysteria became so uncontrollable that their concerts turned into chaos zones, with fainting fans carried away by medics while police formed human walls. In 1966, during their tour in Manila, the madness reached a breaking point. A misunderstanding with the First Lady led to a political scandal. Mobs chased their cars, and their lives were genuinely at risk. It was no longer just Beatlemania, it was survival. Soon after, Lennon's comment about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus ignited protests in America. Records were burned, radio stations banned their songs, and the dream began to crack. Behind the laughter and fame, four young men were beginning to crumble under the weight of expectation. The Beatlemania that had lifted them to the heavens was now consuming them from within. The music industry had never seen fame on this scale, and neither had the world. Every flash of a camera, every cry of a fan, reminded them of how unstoppable the machine had become. By the end of 1966, the Beatles made a decision that would change everything. They would stop touring. The madness had gone too far, and it was time to reclaim what had been lost, the music itself. As the lights dimmed on the world's loudest phenomenon, the Beatles prepared to disappear from the stage. Not as idols, but as artists ready to rediscover their voice. The age of Beatlemania was over, but their story was far from finished. When the screaming stopped, silence returned, and for the first time in years, the Beatles could finally hear themselves again. It was 1967, and the four young men who had once lived inside the chaos of Beatlemania were now searching for something deeper: meaning. The decision to stop touring had shocked the world. For fans, it felt like the end of an era. But for the Beatles, it was liberation. No more endless flights, no more deafening crowds, just the music. It was time to evolve, or fade away. In the quiet of the studio, they began to rebuild themselves. Abbey Road became their new stage, and every note, every lyric became a form of exploration. What emerged from that silence would redefine not just their careers, but the sound of popular music itself. They experimented with new instruments, strange sounds, and surreal lyrics. LSD and Eastern philosophy began to influence their thinking. The cheerful simplicity of She Loves You transformed into the kaleidoscopic world of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Released in 1967, Sgt. Pepper wasn't just an album, it was a statement. It blurred the line between pop and art, between sound and imagination. Critics hailed it as revolutionary, fans called it spiritual, and the Beatles had become something far beyond a band. They were cultural architects, but perfection had its price. The higher they soared, the more fragile things became. Lennon grew restless, McCartney obsessed over production, Harrison sought peace through meditation, and Ringo struggled to find his place amid the tension. Behind the colorful album covers and psychedelic smiles, the bonds that once made them unstoppable began to fray. Fame, creativity, ego, and exhaustion were colliding in ways they couldn't control. When their manager Brian Epstein suddenly died in August 1967, the foundation cracked. He had been their guide, their balance, their shield from the madness. Without him, the Beatles were adrift. Paul tried to take leadership, urging the band forward with new projects like Magical Mystery Tour, but the unity was fading. Lennon drifted further into introspection and found new artistic inspiration through Yoko Ono. Harrison's interest in spirituality deepened, and Ringo quietly withdrew from the growing conflicts. Still, the music kept coming. Beautiful, brilliant, and burdened. The White Album in 1968 was both a masterpiece and a battlefield. Each member worked in isolation, their individual voices louder than the harmony that once defined them. The sessions were tense. Arguments broke out. At times, one or more members would simply walk out of the studio. What had started as brotherhood was slowly becoming a struggle for identity. Outside the studio, the world was also changing. War, protests, and social revolutions were shaking the 1960s. The Beatles, who had once sung of love and hope, were now reflecting the confusion and disillusionment of an entire generation. By 1969, they returned one last time to where it all began, to live performance in the form of the rooftop concert atop Apple Corps. It was unannounced, raw, and pure. For 42 minutes, the old magic came back. Then it was over. The cameras stopped rolling, the amps went silent, and the four men who had changed the world simply walked off the roof. It was both an ending and a farewell. When Abbey Road was released later that year, it felt like a closing chapter. The melodies were mature, the lyrics reflective, the production immaculate. And as the final track, The End, faded into silence, it carried a haunting truth. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. The Beatles had achieved everything the world could offer: fame, fortune, immortality. But they had also lost the simplicity, the brotherhood, and the innocence that started it all. Perfection had demanded too much. And when the dream finally dissolved in 1970, the world mourned, not just the end of a band, but the end of an era. Their music, however, never left. It became timeless, echoing in every chord, every lyric, and every soul that ever dared to dream through sound. The Beatles were gone, but their story would play forever.